Doors are closed. I guess we'll go ahead and get started. Hi, everybody. I'm Chris Osmond, one of the developers at Dev9 software consultancy right here in Kirkland. We do lots of web work, service work, Java, .NET, what have you. I've been with them about 2.5 years or so, and I think what's been great about it for me, from my perspective, having done QA, having done development, is placing in a team and having good dynamics. I work with both Isaiah and Richard here, and I know, on a couple different projects. I know they've been through a bunch of cycles. They've seen things go well and maybe not quite so well. So most of what you're going to see here, I think, comes from a good, solid base of experience. I don't know the slides, so I'm looking forward to seeing it as well. QA can be pretty challenging. Getting it right, it's always a balance, managing data, right tests at the right level, balancing out how much effort, what people care about, what they're sensitive to. There's like way too much to cover. So getting a good framework in place to kind of set some boundaries on that can make a huge difference. And I, for one, look forward to hearing about it. So
thank you all. Welcome to our presentation on preparing and creating a test framework. So we plan to share some ways to be successful with test automation and rapid development. So who we are. I'm Isaiah Cooper, Senior SDET at Dev9, working here for about 1.5 years. I've been in the QA industry for about 12 years. 8 of those have been about SDET sort of lead roles. Then, Drew?
Richard Putney. I'm Senior SDET for Dev9. I've been doing QA for a really long time. 20 plus years in QA. Some of that SDET, most of that has some amount of SDET and white box involved, and about 5 years of leadership as well.
So what can you expect from this seminar? So what your framework should strive to help with, how to go about designing your framework, why they use tools to start building out your framework, and sliding in slides action. So at this point, Richard will take over the first half, and then I will follow up with some more technical stuff.
So first of all, I wanted to say one of the things that really attracted me to Dev9 was the way that they handle some of the stuff that we're about to talk about. So some of the stuff is from my prior experience, and some of it is stuff that I've learned to get better at while I was at Dev9. And I think that we do a pretty good job of answering some of the kind of gaps in rapid development and agile process about how to do QA and how to provide that really well. There's a lot of stuff about Scrum and how to document and stuff like that, but there isn't always a lot of great prescription for how to do QA and how to do it really well. So hopefully we're going to cover some of that and go over some best practices. The first one we have is automate. This is really critical when you're trying to do rapid development. We'll get into each of these bullet points a little bit in more detail. Collaborate. And this is also really critical in rapid development because you're usually working in a compressed time frame. There's not a lot of time to set a flag somewhere, someone else to see it, and then communicate that to someone else. You really have to be sitting next to your teammates and in really close cooperation with them. So test early. We'll talk about this principle. And this is one of the ways you get really good value from the automation that you do, right? Test often. This is also quite possible with automation. And inform. And this is really where the value of your automation shines. Can inform your devs, your company, and helps everyone deliver more quickly. So automation. Automation, of course, I think everyone is obviously really familiar with this. The big pitch is that it gets rid of your regression cycles. If someone makes a change like to your model or something like that and it affects a bunch of different services, that's a huge footprint to have to retest. If you have regression suite, if you have an automated regression suite, It's a push button. All that stuff gets done for you, and you can really focus on the new features and figure out in fine detail what the changes are and what really is the likelihood of the bug harvest. So being able to just push a button and have all the stuff that used to work come back and tell you that it's still working it saves you an immense amount of time. Really speeds up development. It also speeds up the information cycle. So instead of having to you run a test, a manual test, you log a bug that gets prioritized in a bug triage meeting. Someone goes and assigns that to a developer. Developer sees it a couple days later, sees the priority on it, and starts working on the bug. When you have an automated regression suite, a developer can, at their own desk, run your suite of tests and know instantly that there's a problem with the code they've just written, rather than having potentially week or 2 week long cycle to figure out that there's a problem in their code. That information cycle is just instant. And it enforces, it documents and enforces business cases and expected behaviors. So Agile process tends to be pretty lean on documentation in a lot of ways. We do our best to capture details when we write stories, and hopefully we're documenting in code, and hopefully we're maintaining some passive data sources like wikis and stuff like that that provide more information about what we've written. But tests, automated tests, really are a living way to document all this stuff, and it's very accessible. You run the test, it tells you exactly what's happening and when it's wrong. So it can be really valuable for teams. Collaborate. Sorry if I'm going through any of this too quickly, or anyone has questions in the middle of it, that's fine. We'll do a question session at the end as well. So collaborate. Be involved early. It's the earlier you can get involved with the design discussion for a particular feature or service or application, the better. Always try to get good requirements. Be really vocal about that. If you don't have enough information to do what you need to do, you can't do your job, and that isn't, that's not good. So you need to be really vocal. If you don't have enough information, tell someone. Tell your business owners, I need to know this. They might not have, they may have given you as much information as they have, and they might need to make a request to get that information. So say it early and do your best to get that information. If there's ambiguity, just do your best, but always make your pitch to get good requirements early. Share your expertise. We end up as subject matter experts a lot of times in all the stuff that we test. We are working in these requirements constantly, and we tend to span a little bit broader than developers sometimes. We're very much more siloed. It's not always the case, but we are subject matter experts. So if you understand a case and you can inform a discussion, do that. It can help your team, and it can help everyone get to the right page and do the right work soon. You also have the best understanding of what the test footprint will be. So if there's some change and it's going to touch a lot of things, and you know that, make that clear. Say, you can go down this road, but understand this is a big retest, and this is, potentially a big refactor of automation, or this is, we have a whole new suite of tests that need to be written for that. So make that clear. Attend design discussions. I've found that to be really valuable in my career. It's really interesting to see. Usually these happen with architects, devs, and sometimes business owners, and you get a really interesting perspective about how people are thinking about it technically, and also how people are thinking about their business cases, so what's really important to the business owners. So those are really, it's really interesting to have that information when you go to write your tests. It helps you prioritize, and it helps you write better test cases. Embed yourself with your devs. Hopefully everyone doing Agile is sitting really close to their developers. I can't recommend that enough. And try to have good working relationships with your developers. They're going to be your best friends for automation. They can help you get integrated into their project when you need to set up your automation and set up your frameworks. They can help you because they've probably encountered some of the hurdles you're going to encounter dealing with ops and getting set up for your QA environments and your build and CI servers. So they can be your best friends. They also have good language skills that they can help you with. project and pairing with them gives you good insight into the code that they're writing, stuff that you'll have to test, and it can help you again with language skills. Get dev and owner feedback once you've written your test cases and you've written your automation. Be sure and float that to all the stakeholders and make sure that they know what you're covering. You know, part of this is CYA. You want to disclose what you're doing so that that's really clear. And part of it is just if they have ideas, they know things that you should cover that you haven't, they'll let you know and take their suggestions and implement it. Okay. Next is test early. So before you commit, actually, you can run all of your tests and you know, your unit tests, your IQ tests, and your functional tests. You can run all that stuff locally with tools, with build tools like Maven and Gradle. You can run with Maven, use like Maven clean test or clean verify, and it will run your whole unit and IT and functional suites. You can configure your profile to set up to run all of them, or you can set up profiles to run one suite or another. We usually recommend that you run all of them, but allowing developers and testers to run that from their local machine means that before you commit a test change or before you commit a service or a product change, you know that that change is good. And that saves you just a ton of grief. I mean, it's and a ton of embarrassment. You can go fix your code before you float that up to the branch and someone else sees it and goes, what are you doing? So it's incredibly valuable. And again, it cuts that information loop to immediate. You know, before you even check in, you know whether you have a bug. So do it before you commit. One thing that we're going to talk more about is CI, or continuous integration. And so this is after you commit. So what CI is really doing, continuous integration is really doing, is it's running a set of tests, possibly a build and a set of tests, every time you commit code. So we use tools like Jenkins, Bamboo, I have a list of other ones, Hudson. There are a number of tools that do this. But basically what you're doing is on a code commit, these CI tools will execute build commands and run your full set of, do a build, run your full set of tests, and give you feedback for every check-in. So it becomes really easy to see whether a single change made a difference in your code base. It becomes very easy to track. You get really high frequency of test execution, so anytime anything happens to your code base, you know what was the cause. So before you deploy, if you have a shared environment, if you have a QA environment, it's really handy to be able to do these tests in a CI environment or even on your local box, and know that by the time your service gets to a shared environment where you may be integrating with a bunch of other teams, your code is rock solid. So when they put their code there, they know if they have an issue, it's them, and it's not you. It just makes it easier for you to debug and for them to debug in a shared environment. It can also be used as a gate, as a quality gate in an environment. So once you've deployed to an environment, you can run that suite of tests again. You know that you're playing ball with all of everyone else's latest services that are now shared in that environment, and you can use that as a quality gate to go from QA to stage. And in the case of continuous deployment, you could potentially establish a suite of tests that would that people could agree to take you all the way from stage to a production environment. And a lot of that is about the kind of software you're testing, but also establishing confidence in your test suite. And that's having good tests, making sure they're maintained, and promoting your tests within your organization. So this gives us the quality that we need. Demonstrate with code coverage, demonstrate with your reports, and try to make sure that people know what you're doing. So test often. This is really how you get the most value for your automation, is continuous integration. The most value for free. Once you have this set up, someone checks something in, your tests run, and you don't even have to type in a command. You check something in, your tests run, and you know what happened. And that makes all the automation that you spend all that time writing incredibly valuable. You get the reuse again and again and again. If you can't do continuous integration for whatever reason, as an organization, do scheduled runs and try to schedule them with the highest manageable frequency. And what I mean by that is the more you run, the better the granularity you'll have. You can track something down to an hour. You know, if you're running against an environment, you'll know something changed in this environment, who deployed to that environment in this time frame, who made a code change in that time frame. It doesn't give you quite the granularity that continuous integration does, but the higher frequency you can run your schedule on, the better. Let's see. Inform. I should have used a slightly higher font for this. You get virtually instant feedback. So when you run local, when you run through CI, you find out immediately what's going on, so that informs your developers instantly that they've made an error or that their tests are succeeding. And same if you're writing the tests. If you can run locally, you can find out instantly whether they're working. So reporting. This is a little bit different. Tools like test engine.
Sorry, before you proceed. So do you know any tool or framework which supports content publishing systems? Have you ever heard of Sitecore? So it's a way you manage your web pages, and you can just deploy to any environment you want to. So it's not actually really compatible with CI systems like Jenkins. So do you know any very lightweight tool which can plug into any kind of framework and script based or?
So you're talking about a CMS style deployment as opposed to a code
Yes, exactly.
Okay. Talk to us after, and we might be able to come up with something. We have some other people that are a lot more versed in that side of things.
We just did a whole presentation on CMS packages,
Okay.
and so that was like last month, I guess.
Do you have a recording?
We do. And then you can talk to us, we didn't get into deployment, but yeah.
Come see us after. Reporting. Tools like TestNG, JUnit has some of this functionality. I'm not as familiar with their latest versions. I think they've added more and more of this. But TestNG lets you group suites and also tag tests, and that can help you structure your tests in a way that deliver really valuable reporting. What you want to keep in mind when you're structuring your suites and tags is who your consumers are for the reports. You may establish a user creation track for a particular business owner who cares about just this subject. So you might have a suite that runs, and out of that is generated a report that gives them just the test passes and failures that they care about. You might have a BUT suite that gives you just the build verification status that allows that gates whether more tests will be run or whether manual tests or black box tests will start getting involved. But it's really critical to think about who your consumers are for those reports and who you're trying to inform and what information they need. And that can help you develop the structure for your tests. Build integrity is another thing that we get informed on by automation. So we find out instantly, when we build, whether when we do an OFI, if we have failures in IT unit or functional tests, we know immediately that there's a code problem. Also gating, we talked a little bit about earlier. Once you establish your test as a quality bar, they can actually be used to gate between environments. Once you run your tests in QA, if they're successful, you can say, okay, this is good to go to stage and to production and so on. I think the next slide is yours.
So this will be sort of a little more technical. We have some code samples coming up to show sort of the tools that we specifically have used for some of our projects. But basically, before you even decide, what tools you want to use, what languages you want to use, first is like, what do you want the framework to do? Who's going to use the framework? And sort of what areas you need to test at. So Do you have a mix of QA teams? You have manual and automated testers. Do you need to have them? So ideally, they want to be executed by the entire team because a big proponent of the team is in charge of quality, not just QA. Because if everybody's contributing to the quality, well, you just have a better product. And have centralized configuration data input. You don't want your configuration to have to change every single time you run a test. You want it all in one location. Basically, anytime you can enforce some maintainability is the ideal process, so you won't spend too much time reconfiguring tests when something fails. And then with data input, there's a bunch of different ways, and we'll show a couple ideas about this. It's sort of the same sense of you want your data to be able to be changed, not only if there's logic changes that business has decided that they want to do differently, or there's just bugs that happen, so you need to change some of your data inputs. And then finally, what languages should you do the code in. A lot of times with testing frameworks, you want to sort of align it to what the development team is doing. So that's a way for the developers to either contribute or at least execute your tests and understand what they're doing. So what should you not do with your framework? I've seen a lot of bad decisions on the framework that's caused a lot of pain and suffering because you want to be able to execute your tests fast, create them fast, and be able to change them fast. And so do not drive all your tests through external data. We'll sort of touch this at the end of a lot of people have the idea that, how can we get the manual testers to contribute to the test? How can you have business units help out with the tests? There's ways to do it, but if you have everything through external data files, like XML files or spreadsheets, then it's very hard to maintain. Do not have logic flows in a single test.
So can you just explain what you mean under the external data thing?
Mm-hmm.
What is that in opposition to? Do you mean having data in code as opposed to spreadsheets?
Right, so the problem with spreadsheets or just having them just driven by external data is, again, it's hard to sort of maintain these extra files, and a lot of times there's not a good correlation between what this data file is feeding into. So if you have tests, especially with like TestNG and JUnit has really two of data providers, you can actually basically specify your data sets it could be in the same class, and those are pretty easily changeable and
TestNG and what's the other thing you said?
JUnit?
JUnit.
Yeah.
But you still need to build an external centralized service or a database to have to let this call.
Right, and so what we can also do with these data providers is you can actually query the database itself and say, hey, I want a user in this specific state. Give it to me, and then my test can act upon it. Other than, hey, let's hard code this email address that we're going to run this test. Because if you switch environments, it's going to break. If the database gets wiped, it's going to break. If this user updates their state, your test is going to fail. So you basically want the data to be sort of independent of any environmental or logic changes.
So really it's kind of, like if you have all your code in a repository, the stuff running the test, you want to have the data that's running the test in that repository too, and not somewhere else that could
Right.
sync.
I'm not saying you shouldn't not do that all the time, but if that's the way that your tests are being driven, it makes debugging very difficult.
Yeah.
It's like, say, okay, I want to rerun this one test. Oh wait, here's the class I want to run. What data file is calling into that class? Oh, let's find the data. Now, so it's like how to rerun these tests. It can be kind of tricky with the separation. The more you separate your test code from your data, you're going to have headache.
Yeah.
So
You end up having to go through links to coerce the data as well sometimes, depending on how the data is stored in a flat file. Just the hardship of trying to get data into a usable object or usable format in your tests, I think is a pretty strong argument, but again, the consistency keeping
So yeah, don't have logic flows in a single test. So sort of like the unit testing can perpetrate through your integration and your functional tests. Basically, you want to know, hey, I'm going to test this one specific piece. If that fails, you know that this one specific piece is failing. The more logic you have, the more chances it has to fail, and the harder it is to debug. Again, there's cases where you need to do it, especially for like end-to-end flows sometimes, but those do involve some extra things as well. Do not reinvent the wheel. There's been a lot of good development in automation tools and code. So a lot of times, you know, we have these companies say, hey, I want a framework. People start off, you know, integrating like HP units, start making their own calls and all this, you know, make up their validation. But there's a plethora of stuff out there that, you know, it's pretty easy to plug these into the framework. You know, and you know, don't overcomplicate it. Sort of goes to the logic flow is, you want your test to be solid, that you know that one, it's either your test is failing or the code is failing. And if you can discern that very quickly, it's easier to say, hey, it's our problem, it's a QA, we have to fix our tests, or hey, we have some development code that needs to be changed. So a lot of this continuous integration is, you know, it doesn't you know, get rid of all the errors, but makes it a lot quicker and easier to find out where those errors are.
So I'll ask another question, but can you this term logic flow?
Mm-hmm.
What is it? I see a template in my head. What is it that you don't want to be doing there?
So basically, I've seen this happen where you will have a bunch of if-else statements in one test that's driven by the data input. That's bad.
So you want to break them out into lots of little tests?
Lots of little chunks, yes. And with like TestNG, you can actually, you know, set up your data beforehand.
Right.
So separate. So a lot of the times what happens with these tests is you get this data creation, you get the validation, and then you get cleaned up all jumbled into one.
Oh, so you'd be reading something from external data, and then based on what you find in there, you'd be running one test or another.
Right, in the same class. So
Okay, no, you should do that.
yeah.
Okay.
One way I think of it is, if I needed to run code coverage on my test suite to figure out what
Yeah.
then I'm not going there.
Right.
Yeah. So basically, it's, you know, keep it as simple. You want to be able to basically read through your test, and you know, it documents this is exactly what's happening in your test. This is exactly what it's testing in this test. So yeah. So sort of tying into what Richard talked about test early. Mentioned TestNG a lot. That's my personal preference. But basically, it's, you know, just a tool to run your tests and to output reports on what happened. JUnit also has a bunch of plugins that basically bring it up to par with TestNG. So I know a lot of developers just use JUnit. So if you want to keep the consistency, that's fine. But the main thing is you want to do is be able to execute through your IDE. Be able to execute through a CI tool. Basically, you just want to make it easy to execute and report. And with TestNG, as you can see, they have a bunch of different ways to sort of set up your data, set up your tests, set up even your entire suite, so that you get. So again, it's this the separation of the data from the tests, where you're not dependent on your data, because you know it will always be a good state. So here is just an example of TestNG code. The main thing uses this, you know, @test annotation. That actually has quite a few parameters, which you can input different values in. The main thing that's usually used are the groups and the data provider. The groups is how you sort of group the individual tests. So like here, you have the BBT group. So like what we're saying with the CI tool, say, hey, we just deployed, let's now run all the BBT tests. And instead of having, you know, select individual tests that you want to run to specify this, if you have tagged them all correctly, it should just run all your BBT tests. And at the bottom is a sample data provider. This is where, you know, it basically, when you specify your data provider in your test annotation, it will pull in that basically object arrays, and and then it tries to populate those tests with the parameterized values. And so even in here, like I was mentioning before about the external data, you can actually make database queries. You can initialize objects in here. You can actually call it database or set objects. You can actually parse external data if you have some helper methods to do that too. So it's basically a good generic entry into your tests with any number of data types. So it's really good to, and also these are reusable. So if you say you have multiple tests, you want to use a user in one state, you can just have this one data provider, have all the tests, call that, and then that each test will iterate on that one user. So.
When you see these run in the IDE, you can actually rerun a single element. So if a single data set fails, you can rerun just that data set.
So database testing, I'm not sure how many of you actually get into this. A lot of times, especially for a front end, if you just have front end, you're not really dealing with the sort of the middle or the below. It's a good way to validate that the data that you put into your form ends up correctly in the database. There's, you have the typical Oracle and MySQL libraries that you can import. And now, with the emergence of NoSQL type of stuff, which I personally haven't dealt with. But I believe there are some tools out there that help you make these connections to the database and mostly read data. Some people actually let you insert test data into the system, which is a nice shortcut, but a lot of times it wreaks havoc. So always be wary of people giving the keys to the kingdom. Again, even if you aren't doing any database testing, it's good to set these up so like in your data providers, you can actually query these for the data that you want per environment, so you don't have to keep environment-specific tests.
Sorry, what are you testing when you're testing it? You're testing the database?
Right. So like I said, it's a lot of times the testing's handled by the database team itself.
You mean like stored procedures? What are you testing here?
Mostly just the table queries and see that, hey, the data that you inputted in, say, like a web page ends up in the correct tables.
Oh, okay, all right.
So it's not like testing like the stored procs and that all that stuff is working. It's mainly just, hey, did the data that I expect to be inserted make it correctly to the database?
Okay. This is like if you're using it on ORM like we are.
Right.
So.
Yeah, and so I think a lot of the cases what database connection really is to be able to query valid test data per environment, so you're not restricted environment level. But again, processing results can be tricky. It's hard a lot of times to get these data from the specific tables that you want. A lot of times it's huge chunks of SQL commands. But it can provide value if you're able to run these queries, especially for data setup.
So what exactly you mean by queues over there?
Oh, for queues, those more for like asynchronous type of calls.
Redis?
Huh?
Like Redis? What do you mean?
Like, I've used like, I think it was RabbitMQ.
RabbitMQ, okay.
Yeah.
James.
There's ways to be able to test those queues.
I was curious why it is under database testing.
Yeah, I don't remember why exactly. I think it was to test them before they sort of get into the database.
Yeah. So there's different layers of this. You can do some of this through JMS clients, right now JMS client, but ultimately that queue is the interfacing and database table. So I think that's why we included it in here. You can also, if you have direct access, you can look at the table and make sure it's an integration test, make sure that your tests that interface with the client store the data correctly.
Sure.
Direct query. I think that's what it
Just try real quick. Yeah, part of the problem with the database testing stuff is that that's a huge, you could do a whole seminar
Right.
just on this one. So like if you're using Hibernate or JPA, you're going to get one set of worlds and scenarios. You don't want to test Hibernate, but you want to test other parts of the system. If you're using Mydatus, it's going to look different. It's like a bunch of our clients, they use some kind of message queue system, but then the data winds up in the database. So you want to track to make sure things are working. And it starts to get into like is it integration testing really, or so. This slide could be.
Yeah, it's on seminar, so.
We actually talked about that, we could do another presentation just on
Sure.
this.
You that well, you got to schedule it.
So web service testing, sort of the layer above the database, which we're actually currently working on. So a couple variations, the SOAP versus RESTful, hopefully RESTful services. For the web service testing, if you're using REST, Rest Assured is a great framework, a great tool to use. It allows you to do both the request and the response of the body pretty seamlessly and easy. And you can also actually grab objects out of that JSON response too to actually act upon them instead of just doing straight up JSON string validation. So it's a pretty powerful tool. WS Lite we've used, it's a Groovy library to do SOAP. It's sort of the same thing, SOAP with XML stuff. Rest Assured can actually do XML parsing as well. So I haven't used it for SOAP, but I think you could use it as well. And of course down below we have the HTTP unit, which is the bare bones sort of heavy-handed approach to doing the automation of these web service calls. HTTP, so like that.
Good question. Do you know any of these tools can be integrated with post-CI process, after post-build process, before as far as smoke tests and before actually getting into manual testing?
Yeah, so we use the Rest Assured framework in our tests to validate the. So we send in the service call using Rest Assured, and then we can actually validate on that response that we get back from the services.
Okay.
This is all done in the CI before
nice.
we get to the manual process.
How are you setting up the data set that you're running the test against? Presumably you want to make a call and then get certain data back. How are you getting that?
So what we actually use now is we use no the mixins.
I'm not actually a Java developer, so
Okay, so basically we have we convert objects that we want to basically convert to JSON. We post that as the body to our request a lot of these times. Rest Assured allows you to set up the headers, lets you set up the body, what you expect the results to be.
And so what you're testing there is basically serialization and deserialization.
Right, yes,
That's
yes.
actually, oh right.
Yeah.
Okay.
So, what do you see as is it the data provider object you're talking about?
Yeah, so there's a good approach. You can either write out these. You can construct basically the JSON string that you want to pass through. But what we do is we serialize these objects that we know is going to be passed in, and so it's a little quicker for us to construct an object that we want to throw in, serialize it into a JSON string, send that through. Yeah, so it's pretty quick and handy to get a bunch of tests. So you can iterate on that object a variety of ways just by updating the fields in that object and sending it through.
So is your assumption there then that you're developing your own serialization, deserialization kind of framework?
Well,
I mean,
yeah.
we're using a Django, which is the Python-based that framework, and so there's actually a REST, there's a whole big REST thing there that you just teach it how to serialize and deserialize your models, and it does it for you. So, and there's a lot of tests around it in the package anyway, so we just don't need to worry about that. But I haven't always been so lucky. I've had to learn serialization, deserialization stuff, which I guess you're having to do. I don't know whether is there a Java or a REST framework?
Yeah, so this stuff we've been using Java and all this stuff. So what we're actually doing, since we work pretty close with developers, is we help build the object models, and then they have created mixins, basically serializers, for those objects. And so we're able to basically reuse what developers are actually using in production service code, and we're able to use those same objects into our tests. So it's a good way to say, hey, we are actually using the actual production object in our tests and setting all the valid data that the object would be able to handle. So here's a sample in Java of rest assured setup code. So as you can see, we set up the base URI and the path of the service. And then what we're doing here is we're actually setting up this called the request specification and response specification. What rest assured does that is it's sort of the default for the entire suite. So you can set up in here what we're doing is say, hey, we expect that every single request is going to send an accept header and a content type. And then we expect that in this specific instance that a specific error never comes back, because that way we know something's really wrong with the service. So we know that every single request that we make, it first does this validation even before we start testing on our specific service response. So it's a good way to sort of, again, it's to identify very quickly when something has gone horribly wrong and like there's no even point on continuing testing. Because what will happen is we'll get some error down the line where it's like, oh, this such and such failed. But then you hit the, go through it, it's like, oh, well, the parameter that we input was incorrect. And so instead of finding that at the very beginning, you have to wade through all this other little code stuff. This is an example of sort of how you make a request and a validation on a request. So again, this stuff can always be put into like utilities to be able to make a call to a specific endpoint that you're going to do over and over, just passing variables. So anytime you can modularize your actual tests themselves and actually make these objects or helpers, it's very handy to actually pump out tests pretty quickly. So in this specific example, we're saying, hey, we're going to send a path parameter of email and password. We're going to do a query parameter of full login, and we're going to post to the /login URL. Then, so you see the then, we expect that we're going to get 200 back, and that these JSON paths, which we specify in different class, are, they don't have no value, they have something in it. And from then, you can drill down to find out that the first name of the profile is actually correct. So for each of these individual body assertions, it will fail. It can fail on any number one of those. The reason for this, this chaining is rest assured uses the handcrest matchers and validation. So it's an easy way to chain multiple validations under one specific request. So it can get pretty nasty. You probably don't want to have verify the entire body doing it this way. Again, that's also be a point where you can basically deserialize this profile object from the JSON into a profile object, and then be able to validate individual fields that way. So front-end testing, WebDriver, Selenium is pretty common nowadays for your front-end HTML pages. Protractor is getting there with the Angular, which is Protractor is basically a wrapper for the WebDriver JS. So if you really wanted, you could do Angular testing with WebDriver itself. Some other tools like Appium for mobile. You can also use WebDriver to sort of test the native websites on the mobile devices as well. And there's cloud services out there which are really good for testing multiple browsers with your same code instead of having 4 or 5 different VMs in your test environment. All that type of stuff. So here's a little bit of web variable code samples. Simple, go to Google, enter a search, assert that the title contains the search phrase. And ideally, with any of these sort of additional logic or languages that you import, you want to make them driven by your tests. So in this case, you can set your suite to pass in the parameter of what browser type do I want. Based on that, you're going to pick up a different driver. So it's pretty seamlessly to be able to test different browsers, different environments, and you can even specify like the URLs that you want to input. So again, it's no matter what area you're focusing on for your tests, you want to have them to be executed pretty easily through any CI tool, where you can just click a button, run a suite with varying data points so you don't have to keep manually changing all this stuff. So reporting. So you have all your tests running great, and they're passing or they're failing. But you want to know what has happened pretty easily, pretty quickly. So JUnit, TestNG, they have these XML reports that feed pretty well into CI tools. They can display a nice little graph on showing you what your tests are doing. TestNG also has a library called ReportNG. This basically takes the HTML reports that TestNG generates and sort of puts them in a fancy pants type of page that you can quickly find out what has failed, what has passed, and what has issues. The console output, especially for like Maven, you can get a good summary of how many tests have failed, how many tests were executed, how long it took. With any reporting tool, you want them to be able to easily identify errors and be able to identify like what the tests actually were executed. A lot of these reports do allow you to inject comments directly into the report from the code itself. So like if you have additional descriptions or like you have the parameters, what was executed, it can show up in the report so this is everything that happened. And above all, you want the report, or whatever you choose, to be everything. It basically slurps up all the information and reports it to one location. Because if you have to go through 20 different reports to find out the status of your tests, that's going to take a long time each time you do it. Especially if your target audience is more of a business person, to say, hey, we just deployed, what happened to the deployment? If they can immediately see, hey, everything's green, or we have this red spot, and we fix it really quick. That just helps cut down on debugging deployment issues when they do happen. And kind of blurry, but this is sort of an example of a ReportNG sample report. So as you can see on the left, it shows you all the suites that were executed. So the overall status of, hey, this suite all passed, or this one had issues. And then it breaks down how many passed, how many were executed, the total time it took. And then on top of that, you can then drill down into, hey, for this specific suite, for this specific test, what happened. Again, to add additional information, you can output that the reports, what parameters were used to introduce the issue. It might just be a data issue. Any additional logging information, like debug statements if it does fail, so you can output the entire request and response, or even like curl calls to reconstruct what you actually sent through, especially at the web service layer. It's really handy to basically, hey, just copy and paste this to your terminal and see what the response gets. So it's it's a way to not only understand how your test code is doing, but it also allows the developers or whoever's running it to quickly reproduce the issue. Because if it takes a long time to repro, that's more time taken away from actually fixing the issue. And if you're in fire mode time, then it's any time you can save is best. And Richard sort of mentioned about Maven and Gradle for build tools. Basically, it's a preference type of deal. Maven is XML POM files. Gradle is more of a scripting language based off of Groovy. But they need to just basically handle dependencies. They need to import libraries to use. Remember, don't reinvent the wheel. So import all these test tools that are out there. They need to easily execute all of your code. And then, ideally, you want to be able to integrate with a CI tool so you can, get all the benefits that a CI tool gives you. There's also another one called Jasmine. Haven't personally used, but I saw it being brought up for like JavaScript type of testing. But again, there's tools out there, so they're pretty widely used and good to use them. So this is a sample of the Maven POM. It can get kind of big, so there's a lot of parent type of POMs to sort of connect everything together without being gigantic. Maven's also an area where you can import or pass through data to execute your tests as well. So in this case, you have your environment, your browser, and your groups they want to execute for the specific test. And so it has some defaults if you don't pass in anything. But even like this way, your CI tool can say, hey, I want this job to run the BBTs, so pass in the group parameter. Or I want to run this one on the stage environment. So it allows a lot of customization to happen at the command line itself. And a sample of the dependency section, they tell where Maven should look for these repros. And so this is a simple one, just what version do you want, what artifact do you want, you go get it. So the build section, for Maven, it uses a Surefire plugin to actually execute your tests. The main thing here is that the tests have to be in a specific location, which is the source test Java folder. They all have to be appended by uppercase test. That's just the default. If you want to modify those, you can. If you want your sort of, if you have like a dedicated framework for your tests themselves, they might be in a different folder. But out of the box, that's just where they go. And so, as you can see here, here's where you pass in. This is a sort of a test ng flow. You set the system property for your browser. You specify the group that you want. And then for TestNG specific, it also has this idea of suites, which are basically XML files itself. And they can specify what package you want, what classes you want, groups, separated groups. But a lot of times what you just want your test to do is run a specific group that you've already predetermined, or run everything. So being pretty proficient with setting up your groups makes the testing execution a lot quicker and sort of more precise testing. For file side, one question a lot of people get is, should I allow non-developers or non-technical people to write tests? If you do go down this road, a lot of the tools that you can use with the BDD type of languages, behavior-driven development, they're easy to read. It's a lot like the pseudocode for to input into the tests to drive them that way. It can allow for more team involvement, where you have BUs, the business units, or you have people from other teams to be able to contribute to the overall quality. The cons of this, though, is that somebody has to write these hooks for the people. Somebody has to maintain their tests. It's to determine, are they valuable tests that they're writing? A lot of times it's like, hey, you have 1,200 tests running, but how many of those actually test something valuable, other than like hey, let's keep changing, adding A to the first name 20 times. And unfortunately, if you separate sort of the test process between these people, it's hard to adhere them to what the team decided on is what constitutes a good test case and how you construct with that. So there are tools that you can use. There's Cucumber using Scala, Spock with Groovy, and Robot Framework, which uses Python. That's actually developed by Google, so that's pretty well cited for right now. And it also is easy to learn a scripting language if they don't have any programming experience. So one of the things, one of the questions you should ask too is, if you have these manual testers, why not, bring them up to speed? Why not educate them with some code development? And these types of tests could sort of wrap their head around how code can be executed, how tests can be created, using a high-level scripting language. Which, if they want to stick with that, that's fine. There's plenty of other tools to do that. But it can also lead them to actually digging down and debugging code and looking at developers, stuff like that.
What exactly do you mean by do not just keep them external data?
So, sort of ties into not just having exclusive external data to drive your tests. What will happen is you have this, if your whole goal is just for them to enter data into an external file for them to drive these tests, what happens is, one, someone's going to have to maintain that. A lot of times it's not going to be them. So it's going to be on the development team to figure out what these tests are doing, and if something breaks, how to change them. So I mean, if your goal is just to have them put data into some external file, you might just want to bite the bullet and meet with them to see, hey, these are the tests I think of. Are there anything else you want to add? And then we'll implement that, which is a lot easier for you in the long run. But like I said, there's tools or behavior-driven development tools that would be better to incorporate than just having them write all these lines in an external file. It sort of goes along the line too of don't drive your tests just from these files because they can get pretty nasty.
Yeah. And real quick, just it's part of what we're doing in this talk is trying to give like a really as comprehensive as you can way to set up this stuff and get it running. But the language skills it takes to actually just contribute a single test aren't nearly as steep. And I would say most of the stuff isn't very steep. It's actually pretty intuitive if you go and use these tools. Maybe it can be a little hairy sometimes. But most of these tools, very easy to set up CI. You point it at your CI, your branch, and most of it just works for you. Most of the stuff is really easy to do. But for an individual tester who may just have black box skills, to pick up the language skills to just write a test is actually pretty easy. So with some help from more experienced SDETs or developers, they can help you set up the framework and the infrastructure. And then you can bring black box testers on and scale them up over time, and they can eventually contribute tests and then utilities and even framework level stuff over time. But we highly recommend getting involved in that process.
Because again, the quality is the team goal, and the easier you can make individual people on your team contribute, the better your product will be. So, are there any additional questions that anybody had for the slides that they didn't bring up?
We talked a lot about, so the last slide, having your manual testers writing tests, meaning writing automated tests from scratch, but having them relate back to a higher level test, like a test document or a test plan or whatever. I guess my question is, what tools do you guys use generally as far as writing test plans and higher level test documentation before you actually start writing the lower level tests and tests and having your manual test testers even do a manual test in the first place.
Right. So there's a wide variety of tools out, from the basic of just, XML file or Excel spreadsheets. So here's the test we're gonna run. Here's like the class name or something like that. They have tools out like TestRail, which I think is a paid product. But it allows you to enter in your manual tests and actually automate those and actually execute them. So you can have your automated and your manual in one spot. So you can say, hey, let's run this regression suite. Run out the automated tests, then also say, hey, these ones are manual, so let's go through those and start executing those and then manually update their status. But a lot of times, with fast pace, a lot of it's just, hey, enter your test cases in like Jira, and then just go through the list and say, these ones I've done, these are like the classes that they're in, these are the tests that they've done, or these ones can't be automated, so these ones still have to be manual. So it's sort of dependent on who you're working for and the company as a whole on how they write it. Because I know every team has a different way of doing their test plans. It's a lot of it's working together with the developers to figure out what tests do we need to test your stuff, what things can be automated, what can't be automated, which hopefully are very minimal. And then ideally, especially for like the more manual testers, you can start having them automate these regression manual tests that may take a long time. Or you can even have them start just with the entire test plan to start automating these things.
Just real quick, Jasmine from Dependencies actually did a talk on test planning, so I think that's a good one.
Yeah, do you have any additional thoughts on testing from mobile labs?
Test robots? Not at this time. That is a subject I think we're going to cover in the future. But at this moment, I don't think anybody really has much experience with it. With their just haven't had any mobile projects. But that's definitely something on everybody's mind as the mobile gains traction on that.
I'll chime in on that one.
Okay.
So mobile's really complicated to be a whole session. The good news is that most of the platforms like Xcode and iOS and Android, they all are now supporting unit test development as well as there's stuff like Appium for UI testing. So you have something a little bit analogous now to services where you'd say like, this is how you want to approach laying it out. It's not all just trying to drive everything through the UI. The other one is if you're using something like Ionic and Angular, then now you can use Protractor for that stuff as well. So it's doable. It's just more complicated because you have more platforms, right? Like if I said you build a Java CI pipeline and a .NET CI pipeline and a Scala pipeline, you could stuff. If that's the main thing that your users are using your systems to, then it's probably worth it, right?
I feel like third party coming out who have all these phones on a desk all tied up somewhere and run this.
Yeah, there are some services you can do to pump out your test code through there. I'm not sure exactly what
Sauce
you
Labs
need
is
to. Yeah, Sauce Labs.
Yeah,
Sauce
so
Labs.
this time.
So Sauce Labs and Browser Stack, they both fire up emulators.
Yeah.
So what you're going to get with there is a VM. What's cool is that then the VMs are available and you can talk to them via web services like Selenium. So it's good when you start getting into especially things like Android where there's so many devices that you've never even heard of, right? Running all these different versions and then they all of course have OEM loadouts to make them extra special. Yeah, that's where you start winding up with like, well, do I just tell them that if use a Galaxy S whatever, or do you have to
Cheap just to get a new phone, right?
right, or get a whole bunch of new devices. There are labs that do testing too. There's we did some stuff for a while. This was about 2 years ago, where we actually had like we were doing custom Android dev work, and we had the CI machine slaved to talk to the Android device, and it would talk to the BNC and then it would actually control the device with some Linux. So it's a cool way. But that's something that you only want to do for like build verifications because it's not fast. So, just in case you're wondering, I'm the CTO for DevNet. So.
And a lot of mobile stuff too is you want to figure out what you need to actually test on mobile as opposed to just make these web service calls, make tests around that. So the bottom is solid. You don't need to do all this input from the mobile to make sure that it works correctly. So yeah, a lot of it's the UI type of stuff. So it's,
Just like Selenium, you would want to drive all your testing through Selenium.
yeah.
I guess that's what I mean with testing, is that you need to be worrying about exactly the right stuff. I mean, I see people running tests, I'm like, wow, what are you testing there? You're testing like Postgres.
Exactly.
I mean, obviously every now and again it's good to have a unit test there that is showing, it's kind of helping you, it's basically documenting Postgres for you. It's like, you do this, you'll get that back, okay, and that's a thing. But
Yeah.
And then there's, people not writing tests.
Oh, sorry. With mobile, you have a number of factors that you don't necessarily have with a PC user or a Mac user or whatever. And in my experience, there's nothing that really replaces doing it on the device.
Yeah.
You have to automate for scale. I mean, you have so many things and so many iterations of code. You have to automate that, but you really have to do a last test on the device. And AT&T also offers some tools that will simulate network latency and some of those other factors that come in. On the device, there's also issues around power and other things that you probably, it's not directly doesn't work, but to sort of recognize what your power drains are and how you're using certain things and what happens when you get disconnected. Some of the emulator tools do a certain level of a job of being able to emulate that, but you have to be aware of many more dimensions, and it's the reason why I asked the question was it's always evolving, and everybody's looking through that rail.
I'm too much of a wimp to get anywhere near my well suit now. I'm
Yeah.
not going to test this stuff. Oh my god.
That's where, so I would put like sort of an ending plan together, right? Say like, you're going to get 100 tests that you're going to automate.
Right.
You want, that's your budget, right? So you hold that. You try to get the developers to write as much unit test coverage as you can for functional testing and integration testing. And then you also do manual for exploratory. You want to start like power and stuff like that.
Yeah, and when you're dealing with clients, I think that you have to talk to them about mobile being a bit different than the costs associated with, a cloud web application. That there are a few additional test considerations, and it's just a bit more complicated. But everybody's looking for that secret,
There is no silver bullet.
There isn't yet, but it keeps us all employed, right?
Exactly.
There's a company that does that Selenium, isn't it? They're called the Source Labs, aren't they? I guess that's for a reason. They're still trying to find
Secret sauce.
So, one quick question around test data management. So you were suggesting us to keep the code and the data almost together, right? So let's take down to the data source object definition. So doesn't it tend to be redundant? Let's forget about the code, data in the code or data in the file. But many of my teammates, they were composing a lot of JSON and XML files. The thing is, they are just lying in some folders, and God knows what data in there, and we should go and parse it manually. And even guys who are working in the same team write some redundant data, and he puts in his own schema, and he puts in his own schema, and they just, that's crazy, uncontrollable, right? So I was thinking about a prototype more like a test data as a service, putting everything in the database, and all you have to make is a HTTP call. and you got to follow a specific URL based on which environment, which page you are hitting, and what object you wanted, and that returns a JSON file. And this way, everybody composes their data in a central system and gets it from one system. But there are two different entities, and you are more based on the network, of course, right? You can't run your systems locally, test you locally and all. But do you have any suggestions on how to control this test data? Not, how to closely monitor what people are checking in and how to review them. Of course, we can review code effectively, but not test data, right? So we don't have enough time.
Yeah, so once, so Justin, so we started is, you make the test code, the JSON files, part of the project itself. And so they follow the check-in, code review type of process. So you have somebody, going through all these JSON blobs to say, hey, is this the right test data?
Let me put it this way, right? Okay, that makes sense. So let's say I'm testing a sign-in page, and I have a username, password, and one JSON file in my project. And my neighbor who's testing an end-to-end page, something, and he somehow lands on a sign-in page, and he wants to use it again, sign-in data, which I already had in my JSON file. But he's in some other project, and he has to look into my project, look into my JSON files, and get it imported there or copy it there or whatever, right? So it's not really easy. I would rather make my own copy in my own project. And now it's decentralized, and everybody is making it redundant. Right? Just a simple example. When we're all working on, when a huge company is working on one single test project, and you know how to maintain this test data is a huge challenge. So I'm just wondering if you have any suggestions or if you came across it.
I'll throw out one. We've done.
We can talk offline. I don't
Yeah.
know.
You can actually treat your test data as dependencies and then pull them in. So like you can do things like package them up in jars and share them through your Maven repository. So I know that we've done that on projects where the schema itself is actually tracked as an artifact, and then it's checked into the repository, and then you use jars to do dependency management. So there's a blog post on how do you share code, and there's like 3 different ways to share code. The worst is copying files, source run. You can do it as libraries, you can do it as web services, and depending on what you're trying to do, that's what drives which path or how to go down that path. And that's, for me, one of the interesting things is dependency management, especially across technologies. So it turns out, like if you're using stuff, pretty much anything, you can stick files and assets into jars and then move them around, and then use that for dependency management, and that becomes a way to do it. There's a thing called web jars. Actually, I just sent an email about where they do that with JavaScript assets.
Okay.
So
And they are platform agnostic, like you can access this from any coding language you want. Is it?
There's also dependencies.
Yeah, now we're getting into build tools and dependency management stuff, so yeah, we can talk about that offline.
A couple of things we're doing at the moment might be useful. So, in respect to this, so I guess one thing is to make it as easy as possible for developers and testers to create objects. And there are various libraries around that help you just create an object. I'm just going to give you this probably, figure out the rest, defaults. And there are libraries, in fact, where if you create this object, but this object needs this other object to be valid at all, then it will actually create an object there for you. And if that object in turn needs something, so it'll just create just as much of an object tree as you need to do testing. And something I've been working on the last few days is just really hammering on all sorts of little methods that the team can use to create objects, guessing one field from another and so on. The other thing I've been doing is making sure that every class, most of the classes that we're using when we're testing, the classes that we're using object relational macros, so trying to make sure that all these classes have a serializer and a deserializer in the code that anyone can use. So there's one way of serializing and deserializing the objects. So if anyone's creating test data, they'll just use this standard way. We're actually using, mostly using YAML. I mean, in fact, mostly the YAML is actually going in the code. So you have a bit of code and there's a huge bunch of YAML in there, and at the end it just says, right, load all this stuff using the serializer, and that seems to be working really well so far. So there's just a couple of things there. It's making it really easy for people to create objects and having a standard way for people to like author stuff in the database, write it out to YAML, and then they can then subsequently use that for the testing.
That's similar to our approach. You use a lot of utilities to help you build the payloads, and that helps you constrain
So is
what
it
goes in and out.
in-house built or any third-party utilities you're talking about?
It really depends. For most of our endpoints, we're building our own utilities.
Yeah, we're just building everything. We're using a YAML parsing library, of course, but also I found a really nice serializer, deserializer library where every object in our system now has 2 serializers and 2 deserializers. One is used for the REST API, and another is used for YAML, and it can load CSV file, output CSV, and that's the one that we use for testing. So we've put hours into the serialization, so I'm hoping it pays off. But, yeah.
There's one point, maybe I misunderstood. I don't believe the developer coach ever developed the tests for the code.
Right.
Because if the developer you have a blind spot, you gotta see it for yourself. You pick somebody else who takes the spec, comes up with a test, even if it's another developer, so that you get that alternate viewpoint. So, and then you hand it off to the developers so that they can test their stuff before they're bothered to test it.
Right, so, yeah, we do have developers, if the, testers are bogged down by a certain feature that, took like minimal developer time, but a lot of testing time. We have had developers, write functional tests, but what we do is they have to review them with the tester to verify, this is a correct test, this is, you might be missing some pieces here. So it's sort of a reverse sort of test plan. But a lot of times they just focus on the unit type of tests, make sure that they're covered before they even get to testers. But yeah, it's good to have a distinction, but it doesn't need to be like a solid line. If you want to quality across the teams, you need sort of a blurred line between the tester and developer.
Yeah, I'd definitely say there's a huge reason to do the unit test, but I agree. For functional tests, I like to have some separation of powers there. QA is great if you can have another developer that does it, that's awesome. But yeah, unit tests are slightly different philosophically. You're really testing your code to make sure that some small element does what you think it's going to do. And a lot of our tests practice TDD, where you actually write the test ahead of time, and then you code, well, depends on who you ask on our team. Before you check in, you will have written a test that will pass to your code. So as soon as you check in that things basically work how you think that they should. And that isn't the same level of assurance that your QA people are going to do. We're going to just try and break it. But at least you have that cursory level, and that also gives you a lot of benefit when you're doing the CI and stuff like that, because that stuff runs really quickly, gives you immediate feedback. So if you change some service or something like that, you broke something. And those tend to execute given functional tests, which often require deployments or environments and a lot more connectivity.
Just skeptical about developer unit tests. I QA the operating system years ago, and at the status meeting for the week, say something was working. Okay, is it ready for me to test? Yes. That took me more than half an hour or so after the meeting to break the situation Sunday.
That's why we have jobs too.
Yeah, I would just kick it up a little notch even and say that, when people talk about SDET, it's software developer, that first part, and one of the challenges that we've had is that people sometimes will say, take a manual tester and say, oh, you're an SDET now. Like, oh, you've just been anointed as an SDET and now have the technical skill. So we've really talked a lot internally about, everybody's a developer here, you guys are all coming at it. I like the idea of mixing up, having people wear different hats. Like, you know, you take someone who's a server-side developer and you have them spend even a little time working on Selenium stuff, and then they suddenly get a much finer appreciation for, you know, nice selectors and things, right? So I think there's a lot of value in mixing it up, having the different people, but still keep in mind everybody's a developer. You know, in order to do high qualities of everybody.
About a month of mine breaking things, two things happened. People stopped automatically saying, yes, it's done. And the other one is, not to be embarrassed, they among themselves set up a situation with night investigating into this code. It was, the egg on people's face after the first month was extreme.
Yeah.
If you're into tests, can really help increase the quality of your unit tests.
That's sort of why we drive down to the point of, you know, test early, test often. Developers working on a project, pair with them, watch other coding, say, oh, you might want to check there because I'm going to break it right there. So it's a way to sort of, you know, go through the test setups while they're developing code. So when you get it, you can actually, you know, start getting into these nasty bugs instead of, oh, I can't log in. Great, now I can't do any testing for the rest of the day. So
I had a framework question. Are you aware of any frameworks that will kind of slurp up like unit tests or functional tests and repurpose them for like performance and do things like statistical stuff on them, multiple runs, and generate historical data? I'm rolling my own right now to try to do something like this, but
There's something.
just in case something exists, I'd like to use it.
Yeah, there's something called SOAP-UI, Parasoft.
SoapUI has one. We've used Grindr.
There's Grindr is for real clerk, and then if you just want to do like unit tests and then add, there's a framework that lets you add JUnit rules, and so then it will rerun the suite. So like when I did my Java 8 presentation, I was doing a bunch of micro benchmarks. I just added a couple of rules that would do things like three tests for warm up, throw them away, run it 10 or 50 or 100 times, collect the micro benchmark, and then generate the timing data for that.
Like the average and standard deviation.
Exactly, just did all that.
You're talking about JMeter?
No, so
No,
it was a
it's okay.
JUnit rule. I'm like,
Yeah.
I'd have to go check. I did the
It's like, it's not J profile, it's something.
J something, right?
Yeah, it's some annotation that you add to your JUnit test. That,
Yeah.
used to get used variable numbers for it.
Let me check my project.
If you're trying to get that kind of data out of Selenium-based tests, JMeter has a library that will do the whole kit and caboodle for you.
Yeah, basically any version or any area where you're testing, there's at least one or two tools that should be able to help you out to reuse the tests you already have.
No web.
It's thinking about it.
So go ahead.
Well, while we're waiting, I was curious what CI systems you guys use and how the interplay between the frameworks, the various frameworks that you use, and the CI system that will vary one.
Mostly Jenkins.
Jenkins and TeamCity are the primary ones I've used. I've done a little bit of research on Bangalore and I've used them. They're both very easy to set up. It doesn't drive much of the rest of our decision making because they're really flexible. As long as you have a build tool like Maven or something like that, it's very simple.
Yeah, I mean, as long as they support the build tool that you're using, when you have your test running through the build tool, just have your CI tool just say, run this command, this build tool takes all the tests. So it's, I think Jenkins is free, the TeamCity is paid, but it's a little more powerful. But I mean, you can set up a Jenkins server on your local box and have it automatically running your DBT tests just locally. So.
How does Jenkins do with branching?
So you'll point it at a branch, a specific branch that you'll perform CI on. So that's actually something I was going to mention. It's not just every time you commit, really. You'll have a branch that you have CI on, and that branch is being watched. So you might have a private branch, and anytime you do a PR or a merge into that branch, then detects a change on that branch, and then you do CI. So you would usually do CI on a working branch or something like that. You could set that up locally for yourself if you wanted to. but your team will probably just have one or two possibly CI branches.
Yeah, a lot of times if they do like sort of branches, a lot of it's like, hey, when you commit to your branch and so just hey, look at all the branches. We'll just run like a normal like compile that script, make sure that your code is ready to be ready to merge.
I think we were going to aim at having Jenkins run on the master branch, which is where we develop, and then on the release/maintenance branch, basically just those two, right? And then everything else
Yeah.
makes sense.
And you can chain, you could chain jobs to do things like run in one environment, that passes, promote, actually do a deployment and then run another test. And that's how you actually do. We didn't talk too much about continuous delivery, but you could have a completely automated continuous delivery pipeline for the CI system.
You guys do test along with the dev chicken as a package, or?
A lot of times the dev, they'll either execute just unit tests or even integration tests. And what we have too is basically the T-Suite will also execute, because the functional tests right now take about 10 minutes, so you don't want to run a 10-minute test every time the developer tries to check.
Or if it's a small test, like a suite?
Yeah.
Build verification.
I'd
So-
always have the test in the same repository as the
Yeah.
code, right? You're doing that, right? Yeah.
Yeah, we have it as different projects inside the same repository, so everyone on the team can see all the code.
Right.
The test code knows how to talk to the services and all that. So that's how we the object dependencies. So we're using the same objects do for serialized for our
It's something called Carrot Search Labs JUnit benchmarking.
Wow.
So,
Rolls off the tongue.
yeah. Yeah, you just add a Maven dependency and then you add a JUnit rule and you get charts and warm-ups. And you can even persist the results in H2. It's kind of cool. So just email me, Will, at dev9 and I can send you
That's a carrot. So, thank you for that. So I had another question about, with all the kind of proliferation of frameworks, do you ever have a strategy where you try to isolate your direct dependency on a particular framework so you're not like married to it? Sometimes what I found is that the course of a project will outlast choices of frameworks, and so they'll like get to a certain point and they go, hey, we're going to switch. And because of, if you like make all your calls directly to that framework and have your expectations and everything all in the language of that framework, then you have to rewrite everything. But if you kind of want to give yourself more choices and more kind of flexibility, you can put a little adapter layer between your test logic and whatever framework you're in. I found that some of my environments I've been in, that was a really good choice to do. But it's a little bit of an extra cost.
You have to maintain it, and the initial framework ready cost is pretty high. Actually, we did from Coded UI to Telerik, which is a UI platform. All you have to do is create as many abstraction layers in between. It's up to you how far you can go. But sometimes, as one of your presentation, it could be overkill as well. But you're gonna make. What we did is we wrapped around everything, whatever they have. Browser, button controls, links, everything we had wrappers on that, and that's what we are using in the test cases. It's as simple as that. But you're writing one more framework on top of that. So
But it can be really generic.
yeah, and it also depends how often you're going to switch. Is it really worth it?
Yeah, the more you can keep all that framework stuff abstracted from your tests and push it out, I think
The thing is,
Yeah,
for every test case,
it stops becoming practical to a point where you're genericizing everything. I mean,
We spend a lot of time with the abstraction layers.
right, it's that's not very
for every
practical.
test case failure, the guy who's developed the framework will be saying, you're going to regret soon why you
As
did.
far as switching frameworks, you really need to look at your decision-making too. I mean, there's, 15 years ago, maybe that was true, but things are starting to solidify in terms of IDs and frameworks. It wasn't true 15 years ago, but I don't know. This industry still needs standards. They're getting there.
I can understand that it adds another level of maintenance to make it more abstract, and maybe it's not worth it, but I appreciate the comment because we did run through some updates within Selenium and Rake, and they became very unhappy with each other. And I think the versions just weren't meshing on 2 or 3 different kind of libraries.
To some extent, that's just the cost of software, isn't it? It's just like,
Well, yeah, but you might inflate your costs if you're that obsessed with genericizing.
yeah, absolutely. Yeah. No, I'm just saying.
Versus
part
the
of
practical
doing software
application.
is that you're gonna, I know, shit's gonna break all the time.
Yeah, but then we were,
Yeah, it is.
perhaps it was a design flaw, but then we were in a position where we couldn't web test a product. I mean, and we did immediately jump to some back-end testing, which was fast, but it doesn't really replace.
So, to answer you, there's an alternative question to that. That abstraction kind of helped us in some points where we want to use the same test case for laptop and mobile rendering. So if it's a web page testing, right? So mobile renders it in a different way. But the test case is going to be the same. You want to test the login on both mobile and laptop, right? You run the same test case, but in the framework you handle it. Again, you have to make sure you create an abstraction, one abstract layer for mobile and one for check typecasting and check which type it is and run the corresponding test case for mobile. So, how far are you going? So that depends on.
Yeah, I mean, there's steps to encapsulate just your calls. I mean, in Selenium, make page objects that have similar IDs and all that. So, hey, if all of a sudden the back end of how to actually make a open page call changes, you only can handle it because you've added the abstraction to wrap around that and say, hey, look at this, call this, use these IDs and all that. So, it's per basis. You don't want to start out making everything so generic, but it can be
Probably case by case, if you think about it, it probably helps to be pretty cognitive.
Well, in my case, I was in a situation where I knew that we were going to be changing frameworks. It was like given a deadline, it's supposed to be deprecated, it's supposed to be started, and you had to support both at the same time, so I just came up with kind of generic one. I had dependency injection for the logger, for the runner, for the thing, and I just picked whichever framework instance I wanted and stuck it in there. That's what generic. So it was good, but like I said, it was a little extra work up front.
We're using a Sentry, which is, every time an exception is raised anywhere, it gets sent to Sentry, which is this little server. It has a nice API for all sorts of languages. I guess it's at the moment, it's picking up bugs every now and again that no one kind of, there was insufficient test coverage, an exception gets raised, someone messes up, we find out about it. And how do you see that sort of tool fitting in with QA? I mean, at the moment it's kind of, it's like we didn't break the bill, but we certainly broke stuff. How do you see that fitting into
System down.
that sort of
Yeah, that kind of stuff, especially if you're already in production. The system's monitoring production, those are pretty much insufficient bugs and pretty high priority issues. We didn't talk too much about static tools and that kind of stuff, but it's sort of the same class of thing where it requires a little bit of active engagement to see what's going on there. I've seen other things where reporting tool, email reporting tools that'll go and validate a bunch of stuff and raise errors and stuff like that. But it requires someone actually looking at that list and paying attention to it and responding to it. I think it's probably if you have someone that you can dedicate to it.
we just all get a hit chat thing. If any exception is raised, bang, everyone's, yeah, we hit it pretty hard.
Yeah, it's hard to, because if you have too much noise too frequently, you basically invalidate your test, because
Yeah.
like, oh, this keeps failing, like, no, we're not gonna look at it. But, well, valid things can be failing, so it's also one of the challenges, as a tester, to figure out, okay, one, can I, add better logging to my failure, saying exactly what's happening? Is there a point where you just start, marking these bugs as, we want to see this at a later time, file a bug on it, and then we just keep going on.
Sentry's pretty cool because when an exception is raised, it creates a group of exceptions. So every other exception is exactly the same. It groups, and then you can log in. There's a fantastic red UI, I know it's 5. You can add comments to it, and we can actually create a JIRA ticket from the exception having been raised. And then once we fixed it, we add a comment in Sentry to that exception saying, yeah, we're on it, we fixed it, this is the ticket. So it's become really important with Jenkins, Sentry, and everything else.
Yeah, that sounds pretty awesome.
It is.
You have one area, one specific spot to
Yeah. JavaScript can send exceptions to it as well. Python, Java, so the actual things running in the browser, the crash, you can actually have something there that will send it to a server, and then we'll see on hit chat that like someone had some JavaScript thing crash in the browser, so it's pretty cool. And it gets sent the whole stack as like a whole bunch of information about the call stack as well, so you can actually see the code. So
Is it Sentry monitoring too explicitly?
SCNTRY.
Or SCNTRY?
Yeah, it's a kind of, I guess it's a kind of a logging tool really, but specifically it's about logging exceptions that have been raised in your code. You can send it anything. It was originally a Django app, and then it was spun out into a separate thing. It still runs Django, and there's now a company that offers, I guess it's the same one, but Sentry as a service in it. There's a hosting thing. We don't do that. We run it ourselves because our app is also Django. But we only brought it into the company like a few months ago, and it's now become like if Sentry goes down, then we're all really grumpy. So really recommend it.
Sure. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you everybody for coming and some answers.
Very much.